Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And pleasure to rise today and speak in the House of Commons on this motion again, fall economic statement. But I'll note, Mr. Speaker, that it is May 15th, according to my clock here. May 15th? Pardon me, May 10th. May 10th, I'm a little ahead of myself. It's May 10th, and we are debating the fall economic statement here in the House of Commons. Earlier this week, we were actually debating the Budget Implementation Act. Nothing shows more this government's lack of control over an agenda than debating the fall economic statement in May 10th, 3 weeks after the budget address, which is the main financial statement made by the Government of Canada here. There's a problem here. There's a pace that has to happen in this House of Commons of legislation getting through and actually getting into legislation for Canadians to understand what their economics are going to be going forward here. And today, once again, we are at the fall economic statement, something delivered in the fall that we haven't implemented into Canadian legislation with. However, the government's still acting as if that legislation has passed. Everything we see is actually the government pretending that there is no debate to be had here. That's already being instituted into law. Expect this to be had going forward here. Likewise with the budget that they've put on the table 3 weeks ago, and we debated for the first time in the House these last few days, the Budget Implementation Act. I'm going to note, for Canadians' sake, the Budget Implementation Act had very little to do with the budget that was delivered in this House of Commons 3 weeks ago. There are a number of measures in the Budget Implementation Act, debated earlier this week, that are from the fall economic statement. Somebody needs to explain that to Canadians, how these things are not matching going forward here. It is a litany of all kinds of virtue going on paper with no plans to implement what's going forward here. But the problem with understanding the Budget Implementation Act is that if you're going to put the fall economic statement legislation into the Budget Implementation Act, people are going to have to understand what their budgets are actually going to have to look like. There's no detail or announcement of any of their tax increases in the Budget Implementation Act. No details at all. So Canadians are still left guessing about the details that they're putting forward here on a budget. Budgets matter. Budgets matter to Canadians. Budget matters to businesses across Canada. But it's my job here in the House of Commons to try and bring some financial discussion about what's actually in these budgets. So let me talk about some of the issues the government talks about. In Canada, real GDP is down. We talk about an economy that's going well. Well, real GDP continues to decline. GDP per capita continues to go down. That means the amount of economic output per person in Canada is continuing to decline at a steady rate. The government uses a ratio here called the debt to GDP ratio. And I know I've gone on about it previously, Madam Speaker, but I'll go on here with some detail because I'm hoping that people will understand it a little better. Canada's debt right now is approximately $1.3 trillion. That's the federal government's accumulated debt. Canada's GDP last year was approximately $2.1 trillion. So 2.1 trillion divided from 1.3 gives you a debt to GDP ratio equal to 62%. 62% is our debt to GDP ratio, and yet our government pretends it's in the 40% range, 42%, although 40% was their number they said they would not cross several budgets ago. And they continue to cross that and let it grow. So how do they get to this number that it's around 42%? Well, they add back the pension fund assets of Canadians. And that includes the Canada Pension Plan, which is about $600 billion of savings that are deducted directly off the paychecks of Canadians. And that was raised again this year. Those contributions from Canadians into the Canada Pension Plan were raised again this year. So about $600 billion is sitting in Canada's pension savings to distribute to Canadian pensioners when they retire. The Quebec pension plan similarly has about $100 billion of savings in it for Quebecers alone. So total, $700 billion. But this is not a $700 billion pool for the government. The thing about pension accounting is it is about assets and liabilities, like all accounting. And although there is a balance on their financial statements, there is also the liability of paying that to the people that paid into it for years. And Canada's chief actuary last year determined that all things going well, the Canada pension plan system is sustainable to pay the pensions that Canadians expect for 75 years. What that means is it's okay, it's balanced, but the assets and the liabilities are in balance. Everything collected in there is going to be paid out to the people that put the money into it. Therefore, if I may say with a close, it is not the government's financial asset. It belongs directly to Canadians from money that was deducted from their paychecks and should not be used in their debt to GDP ratio. I'm also going to talk about where we're going with this, because pensions are a major part of Canada's sustainability going forward here. And pensions matter in many respects, and this government is moving in a direction to try and change that pension management system because it wants to oversee it through its regulatory arm, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. And that has to stop, Madam Speaker, because these are organizations that do need to manage one thing, and that is the outcome for the people whose money they're saving. That is what they should be doing. Whenever you ask a regulator to go in and change what's happening at an organization like a pension, what you're effectively doing is saying, take your eye off the ball about what you're supposed to be doing here and put your eye back onto something else here. Well, let me tell you what that leads to. That leads, like in the United States, to bank failures. Bank failures at smaller banks where they weren't matching their assets and their liabilities. And as a result, when interest rates changed, a whole bunch of smaller banks had a run on their capital and could not meet their liabilities. As a result, they went under. That's an example of where people that are in the financial industry are being distracted by other regulations being put on their plate from governments and regulators that takes away from what they should be doing for their client base, and that is managing their money effectively. Every pension manager, every money manager in the world has one mandate. Make sure that you're not losing money for your clients. Make sure that you are actually making money, and hopefully making money at greater than the rate of inflation, which we aren't in Canada right now. And hence the reason we have falling GDP per capita. We have more Canadians coming into the country, and they are not keeping up in the economy. Now let's look at, tear down what actual gross domestic product is. It includes the contribution of everybody. What does it also include, Madam Speaker? It includes the contributions of governments. So government spending goes into GDP. And I'm going to suggest to you that if the government's spending, pardon me, I should say overspending, again, planned overspending of $40 billion this year, going into the GDP increase, if that wasn't there, we'd actually be in a very negative scenario. The problem is these things have to balance over time. We are a productive economy. We had a good economy before this government monkeyed around with it and decided that they could replace private sector investment with direct public sector investment. They're wrong. We continue to run deficits. There is a cliff we're going to hit at some point in time here, Madam Speaker, where we're no longer able to meet our needs going forward because everything that we put into our savings is going to be whittled away into interest payments on our debt. And this coming year, that interest payment on our debt is $54 billion. This is the government's number of what that's going to be. I suggest it might be higher as the debt's going to be higher than they realize also. $54 billion from Canadian taxpayers to pay bondholders. It's going up, and even in the government's documents, they say that ratio has doubled in the last few years. A significant increase, a significant weight on the pockets of Canadian taxpayers who need to make sure that they are sustainable going forward here. It's madness. I'm asking the government, I'm asking the few people I see actually taking notes on what I'm telling them here, that you've got to get back to balance. This budget, every budget, should be about getting to balance. And I request that you go back to the drawing board and look at what you can do here to get our economy back to balance and actually sustain this country going forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker.